Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm here today with Dr. Courtney Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a specialist on the history of medicine, and the Institute for Humanities thought that she might have some interesting insights or perspectives to share on this current pandemic and this current interesting era that we're going through. So Courtney, I was wondering if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what exactly a historian of medicine is. What does that mean?
Okay. Thanks, Julia, for having me today. It's really a pleasure to talk about this, even given the current circumstances. So I'm a historian of science and medicine, as well as gender and women's studies. And I was trained in the history of science and medicine at Yale University, completing my PhD there in 2015. The history of medicine is a fairly broad field, but we can sum it up with a few short dynamics. Historians of medicine tend to be interested in the history of health and healthcare of doctors and patients and the other professionals who work in biomedicine and in caring for patients, including family members, and of diseases and therapeutics. My particular expertise tends to be in the area that has been referred to as the social history of medicine, so history from the bottom up. What that means is I tend to be most focused and interested in how patients experience disease and treatment and how we build social and cultural narratives around it than necessarily the work of scientists in laboratories.
So would you say then that disease is kind of one of those biological truths that just doesn't ever change over time? Or, is it, because there seem to be different ways people experience disease in terms of where they are on the social ladder or where they are in time? Is it something that's hard to fix or place?
This is a great question, and it really speaks to the heart of what the history of medicine is really interested in. So if I can quote a colleague of mine, Manon Perry, pandemics and disease are not just biomedical phenomenon. So a virus is just one component, one piece in a much wider network that helps us to understand its spread and its severity. So in the history of medicine, we tend to break down histories of disease and illness into really two kinds of categories. There's always the biomedical reality. There's a virus, there's a disease entity, there's the set of symptoms, there's the mortality rate, things like that. But there's also a social component, a social side, what we have referred to as the social construction of illness. And what this is the broad set of social, cultural, and political context that shapes how we understand a disease, how we respond to it, how we think about disease, and how people experience disease, what patients' lives are like.
Okay, so if I understand you then, on one hand, sure, yes, there is this medical or biological reality of a disease, but that's just one part of it. And there's actually a lot of stuff going on around that disease that helps us kind of understand what that disease means to the people who are experiencing it in the moment.
Yes, and there's a few great examples of how this can work. So one classic example that we love to use in the history of science is the history of tuberculosis, which in the 19th century was often referred to as consumption. So the actual bacillus, the agent that causes tuberculosis, was discovered in the 1880s by German scientist Robert Koch. So before that point, nobody knew what caused consumption. They knew it was wasting disease that was a long and slow death, right? But there was a sense, a belief that it was mostly actually hereditary. So people couldn't help that they had this disease. They got it through no fault of their own. And so tuberculosis, before the discovery of the bacillus, was actually seen as this very romantic disease. It was a disease of artists, of poets. If you are familiar with La Bohème, the opera, right? The sort of beautiful Mimi who's dying in a beautiful fashion. A lot of the poetry of people like Poe and Baudelaire draws on this image of the beautiful invalid who is sympathetic, who is kept at home, who is cared for by their family. Now, after you discover that tuberculosis is not a constitutional hereditary wasting sickness, but in fact caused by a bacterium that can be spread from person to person, then the person who has tuberculosis is no longer sympathetic. They become instead stigmatized. They become the causative agent. They become dangerous. So we go from the image of the person with tuberculosis as being very sympathetic, even romantic, to being somebody who's dangerous and needs to be taken away from other people because they might, they might infect others. And this is a good example of how the biomedical understanding of a disease, what we know about it, can actually shift the social experience of being sick, as well as how we think about people with a particular disease, what stigmas they experience, who we assume is a carrier, and things like that.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for kind of explaining what history of medicine means and what the field is like. For those of you who are just joining us on Facebook, I'm Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm joined today by Dr. Courtney Thompson, who's an historian of medicine. And she's just been explaining to us that there are, various components to the history of medicine to help us understand disease in a fuller context than just the biomedical agent, I think you were calling it. So nowadays we're dealing with this disease called the coronavirus or COVID-19. So what exactly is this disease? One's been referenced.
So the coronavirus disease, or COVID-19, which is called such because it was discovered in 2019, therefore COVID-19, is an infectious disease that's caused by SARS-CoV-2, or severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. So we have the virus, we have the disease that causes it. And coronaviruses are actually a group of related viruses. So we've seen coronaviruses before. That's why this one has these numbers attached to it. That's to differentiate it from other kinds of disease.
Okay. And what makes this disease particularly dangerous? Because one thing that I keep seeing on Facebook and that I keep talking about with my relatives is that, like, oh, it's not as bad as the Spanish flu, or more people die from the normal flu every year, and more people died in the state of whatever from pneumonia than from this. So is this bug really very dangerous? I mean, what makes it special right now?
So there's a lot of pieces to this question. I'm going to try to give you some terminology, and then we'll try to piece all this out. So stop me if you need to, Julia. So the first, just to start out, I'm not an epidemiologist, so somebody with a science background could probably explain a lot of this better. But here are the basic pieces that we are concerned with, and some of this language might be familiar with you. So there's a few different pieces that we use in epidemiology and in history to track the sort of rate of spread, as well as the virulence and the danger of disease. So one of them is the R0 factor, which is the contagiousness of a disease. Basically, how many people, a virus or a bacteria or whatever, how many people get infected if one person is sick. So some diseases have very low R0 factor. Something like seasonal flu is usually about 1.3. Some diseases have a very high R0. Measles has 11 to 18, which is a very high R0.
Wait, so if you say like 11 to 18, does that mean that for every one person who's sick, they're going to give it to like 11 more people?
Yes, up to 11. So COVID is at about a 2 to a 2.5, which is higher than seasonal flu, but lower than some other diseases like measles, which sounds really great, except that we also have to consider how is a disease spread. COVID is spread by respiratory droplets. So if you and I were having this conversation in a room, as we're talking, we've got respiration coming out, and we could be infecting each other in that way. There's also the fact that as we use common items like a phone or a glass of water, we could be leaving the disease behind us in other ways as well. So what we're looking for are things like the R0, the case fatality rate, which is one everybody's very concerned with, basically how many people who contract the disease die, and symptoms and severity. So when people like to compare this to the common flu, right, the flu every year, just a few numbers to put this out here. So the R0 for the common flu is about 1.3. COVID is about 2 to 2.5. So it has a higher R0. It is much more spreadable, essentially.
Okay. So more people, so it's easier for the COVID-19 disease to spread than it is for just the normal flu.
Yes.
Okay.
The incubation rate is also a lot longer, which is another important factor. So the common flu is usually about a 1 to 4 day incubation. COVID can be as long as 2 weeks. Now that matters because I could spread it to you. And then it might take you 10 days, 14 days to get sick. So you don't know that you are carrying the disease, which means that you could be spreading it to others. So with the flu, the common flu, that window is a lot shorter, but it's a longer window for coronavirus.
Okay.
The hospitalization rate is also a lot higher. Common flu is about a 2% hospitalization rate. COVID is hitting around 19%. And then
so about like 1 person in 5 who get COVID would have to go to the hospital.
Yes.
It would be that bad.
And that's a relatively high rate for a respiratory illness like this. And then there's the case fatality rate, which is, of course, one everybody's concerned with. And this is very hard to estimate right now, in part because testing is inconsistent, in part because we won't know how many people who are sick are actually going to die and what other factors might be influencing that. But the common flu is usually about 1.1%. Whereas COVID is at least 1% and perhaps as high as 3.4%, depending on, and these numbers are changing. So
right. So about every 100 people who get COVID, about 3 to 4 will die from it.
Yes. And of course, this varies according to other kinds of health issues, other kinds of structural equality, whether medical supplies are available, and so forth. So I think it's pretty clear that it's very different from the common flu. However, the question of Spanish flu gets a little bit more interesting. So the influenza epidemic of 1918-1919, which is commonly referred to as the Spanish flu, but it's not a very fair name for lots of reasons I can get into, resulted in about 500 million infections during a 2-year period at the height of World War I, which was actually one of the factors that led to its spread. The death toll has been variously estimated. This is hard to estimate because people were dying of other things. Maybe things like malnutrition affected whether somebody was likely to.
Oh, okay. Courtney, you froze there for a moment. I will take this opportunity, though. We'll get back to you when your internet unglitches. But I'll just take this opportunity to remind the folks who are with us and who are watching that Dr. Thompson is here to answer your questions as well. So if you do have a question for her, oh wait, Courtney, pause. You froze for a few minutes. So I'm just reminding everyone that if they have questions, they can ask those questions in the comment section on Facebook, and we will get to those questions. I'm going to ask you to go back maybe about 10 to 15 seconds. You were saying height of World War I was one of the reasons why the Spanish flu spread so rapidly.
Yes. So it's a bit complicated because, again, there's lots of factors that lead to the spread of disease. But one of the things that's really key to any disease spread is the movement of people. Okay. And during World War I, you had a lot of people moving, soldiers moving, right? We had soldiers going from the United States to Europe and to other parts of the world. You have the movement of people, say, if your city is being bombed, you're going to flee, right?
Right.
So disease tends to follow people as they move. This is true with pretty much every epidemic in history. In World War I, what you see are a few interesting things. So it absolutely followed the movement of soldiers throughout the sort of throughout Europe. It followed troop movements, but there was also the fact that transportation was different, right? With faster movement of people as well, that also helped it to spread. Because if you have people moving very rapidly, let's say in the case of coronavirus, this has been a really important factor. If you get on a plane with coronavirus and you land 6 hours later, and then you pick up your luggage and you get in a taxi and you go grab takeout and then you say hi to the neighbors and you don't get sick for another 10 days, then you've spread it around quite a lot. Hundreds of years ago, you couldn't move as fast. And what we see in World War I is faster movement than you had seen in the 19th century and the 18th century, certainly. So you have a lot of soldiers moving around. And then the exigencies of wartime means that there's food shortages, there's general malnutrition, you have a lot of displaced people, a lot of other kinds of mitigating factors that shape the way disease worked. Not to mention that a lot of medical personnel were deployed. So once things like Spanish flu hit the United States, there weren't necessarily the physicians or the nurses or even the supplies to care for all the people who were sick. So again, the Spanish flu, which I hate that name, sorry, the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, which happened in 4 waves, incidentally, over about 2 years, was a very unusual pandemic for a lot of reasons. And the ways in which it was different, I think, are worth highlighting. So First of all, the overwhelming majority of the people who died in the influenza pandemic were between the ages of 18 to 45. So people in the prime of their life, very young people. Most flu has sort of a U-shaped curve. It's very old and the very young who die, infants and the elderly. What happened with the pandemic of 19...
Okay, Courtney, I think you froze for a bit. Hi to everyone who's been joining us. Okay, Courtney, can you back up just a little bit? You froze for just a few seconds. So you were just explaining the U shape of the normal flu.
So, yes. So the U-shaped curve means the elderly and infants tend to die more frequently. The pandemic of 1918-1919 had a W-shaped curve. So you have the very old dying, the very young dying, but then this big bulge in the middle of young, healthy adults, which had impacts on the war because a lot of those were soldiers, and also had impacts on the economy because a lot of those who were dying were workers. And so this meant that a lot of the excess mortality was in the young. So that's the first thing. The target demographic was different than normal flu. The incubation rate was even shorter than the usual flu. Incubation rate with normal flu is usually about 4 days. This incubation date was about 2, which meant that it's moving even faster through people, and it's getting to people a lot more efficient. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. Which means that in some ways that was good because it meant it could be identified, but soldiers were still being deployed. Compared to our coronavirus, we have much longer incubation rate, which makes it a lot harder for us to identify those cases. And the case fatality rate is the remaining question comparing Spanish flu to our coronavirus. The 1918 rate was at about 2%. Sometimes higher in some regions. And here today we're hovering between 1 to 3.4%. I think this is why people like drawing the comparison. I don't think we're going to have 100 million people worldwide die from coronavirus, at least I certainly hope so. But because of globalization, because of the speed of movement of people, and because of the long incubation rate, it actually has the potential to spread a lot more than influenza in 1918, 1919 ever did.
Right. Okay. So you would say then that the comparison of the COVID-19 virus to the Spanish flu, the 1918-1919 epidemic, is imperfect, but there are some similarities there that make the two of them stand out.
Yes.
Apart from I would say, because I guess more mundane or more normal mainstream disease.
Yeah, I think that there's always a tendency for us to try to find a comparison point. Perhaps because we want to feel reassured, but perhaps because it should give us lessons for what we should do now. And I think there are certainly lessons learned during the influenza of 1918 that we have been somewhat putting into place in present day society, but it's still not a perfect comparison, in part because, and this is where the two aspects matter, the biomedical model and the social model.
Right. So
the social model matters because we live in a very different world than 1918, right? Mass travel, especially via plane, which was not a thing in 1918, means that any disease can spread a lot more efficiently than a disease could have in 1918, then 1818, then 1718. We also have the fact that we live in a much more populous world, as well as a much more densely populated world, which is another way that disease spreads. So the globalization itself is actually shaping how this disease is being experienced and how it is spreading. Now, on the plus side, we also live in a very different medical world, right? There's lots of kinds of treatments and innovations that simply weren't available 100 years ago, which is affecting, I think, how research is being done. If nothing else, what we are doing right now, being able to share information even though we're not in a room together, has great potential for biomedical developments in this period and for scientific research. So there's lots of lessons we can learn from history, but I think that just wanting to lump this in with the influence of 1918 and say, oh, well, we don't have these millions dead means that we're doing a lot better is way too simplistic. And I think it ignores a lot of the big factors of what makes a disease and an epidemic specific to its time and place, which of course all diseases are.
Right. So, and actually, I've got a good question that's following up from that. So we've started to get some questions now on Facebook. So
Great.
just a reminder to all of those of you who are tuning in with us, if you have questions for Dr. Courtney Thompson on the disease, especially how to think about the disease, how we're processing this disease, what this disease means, kind of in a broader context of larger disease history or a broader context of the kind of society we live in right now, please put that question in the comments there on Facebook, and we'll try to get to it during this interview. So the first question I'm seeing right here is a question from Aaron Jackson, and he has a question about the R naught value, and he's asking about how that depends on social customs. So he says, is the R naught value intrinsic based on the microbe itself, or does it depend on the customs of the place where people have the disease? And so he says, for example, would an R naught be different in a society in which handshaking is not a custom versus society in which handshaking is a custom? Or, and I'm just thinking as a French historian here, in a society where you do a lot of kind of blowing kisses on cheeks to greet people.
This is a great question. I have to be honest, I think this might be a question for an epidemiologist as to how R naught itself is calculated. But again, I think this is a good example of the specificity of a disease to time and place, as well as behavior. Human behavior certainly shapes disease. The example I'm thinking of is that when the SARS epidemic occurred, about, what was that, 2003 or so, I think, right?
Right.
This was an outbreak in mostly mainland China and then Southeast Asia. And as a public health response to that particular outbreak, after that time is when the practice of wearing face masks in Southeast Asia really took off. And part of this actually has to do with social norms, right? These are societies that tend to be a bit more communally focused than individualistic America, right? So on the one hand, they had the lessons, the immediate public health lessons of covering your mouth all the time when you go out. But also they had the sort of cultural norm of, do I do something for me or do I do something for my community? So what you're seeing right now is that some of the countries that have been most successful in halting the spread of, in flattening the curve, as the language goes, are places like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, which first of all witnessed SARS firsthand, and so built up some sort of public health responses, but also where there was a cultural norm of wearing a face mask in day-to-day life, which made it more normal, which meant it wasn't so weird to go out in public with one.
Right.
Did that affect the shape, the R naught? Not necessarily. Did it affect the spread of disease? I think so. So they took a lesson from history, maybe recent history, but still history, as my colleague Manon Perry says, history is the laboratory of public health. And I think that we're learning that right now in a lot of ways.
Right. So I have another question for you. And this question, and I'm going to wait until you come back because things have frozen up a little bit. And I'll just remind everyone, we're taking questions on those from your comments on the Facebook page. So here's a question, another question from someone who is saying that he has read reports that some victims after rehealing from COVID have gotten the disease again. And they're kind of asking what you think about this claim. And, is the airborne transmission of COVID a controversial topic that he's heard a lot of different ideas about this? Is airborne really the way the disease spreads, airborne transmission? So do you have any thoughts on those questions?
Well, I think these questions might be questions for a biomedical researcher. However, I cannot make any claims about how the disease spreads because I do not kind of work. However, what I do find very interesting is how we are all learning the language of science right now, especially concepts like asymptomatic. Most laymen were not familiar with before this point. Again, lots of lessons from history about the necessity of knowing about these things, but even the language that's being used in this question I find to be very fascinating because it says something about how we're all becoming sort of public scientists. We're all engaging in these kinds of biomedical questions.
Yes, and I'm also, if I can just throw my own question in here, privilege. I'm the interviewer. I'm thinking it's really interesting how people are taking this disease in very different strides. So some people, I remember, especially when all of a sudden we kind of started to get a bit like, oh, something's going on. Some people were saying, oh, we're so overreacting. This is not a big deal. There's been a lot of kind of politicization of this topic. Everyone seems to kind of have a slightly different understanding of what's going on and what it means for them. And I think some people are having a hard time as well comparing what they see on the news, which is often very dire or very frightening or very kind of end of worldish, with what they might be experiencing in their own community, which could be, very mundane or, very calm, or, they don't know anyone with it yet. And so they seem to think, well, what's really going on?
Can you just simplify the question, Julia? I'm sorry.
Oh, I wasn't really making a question. I was making a very long-winded observation. I just think it's interesting how different people have different perspectives.
Well, sure.
On what's going on right now. So,
well, I think this is actually one of the things that I find to be so satisfying about the humanities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything old is new again, always. Was it Faulkner who had the famous quote, William Faulkner, the past is never dead, it's not even past, right?
Yes.
So what I find to be very, experiencing epidemics, experiencing disease and death is a human experience. It is to a certain extent always tied to time and place, but there are aspects to it that feel very universal. And I think that there's a lot of works of art, of literature, poetry, plays, as well as historical documents that when we read them, even though they are people who are experiencing, for example, Daniel Defoe writing a diary in 1660s London experiencing the bubonic plague, or accounts of cholera from the 19th century, or AIDS memoirs from the 1980s. These accounts, you read them, and they're about very different diseases in very different times and places, but they convey something about the essential humanity of what we're experiencing. And they also, I think, demonstrate that there are some emotional experiences that are constant, that are consistent. I have a few examples of my favorite here that I could read out if we have time, but there is something to me that I find to be very compelling as well as hopeful, that on the one hand, this is a way for us to connect to the past, to say that this thing, this fear, this anxiety, this isolation that I am experiencing right now is actually very similar to that experienced by Defoe in the 1660s. And I find something that helps give this moment meaning to me.
So Courtney, I really appreciate how you were just saying there.
On the other hand, there's mistakes that were. Sorry, go ahead, Julia.
Oh, no, it's just you froze for a second, so I was filling frozen time with just kind of repeating what you were saying. That I think it's very heartening that you're able to take this experience right now that we're going through with this pandemic and see it as a way that you can connect with the past, that you can connect with people who have felt similar emotions and experienced similar difficulties in the past. And I think you were continuing though saying something else, and I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's also still a lot of lessons we can learn about things that didn't work from the past. And I think some of the questions people are going to ask will probably get at some of that.
Yes. Well, speaking of questions from people, we're getting a number of them in right now. One question that I'm seeing has a lot to do with what you were just talking about. And it's a question from Morgan Robinson. And she's asking that, are there any lessons that we can take from history that will help us all learn how to emerge?
That's a wonderful question. And this is again why the comparison with the pandemic of 1918, 1919 is more complicated, because there were two kinds of reemergence happening. There was also the mass demobilization at the end of World War I, which sort of complicates the question. A big part of the reason why that pandemic has been referred to as America's forgotten pandemic is because it was so overshadowed by the experience of war, the loss of so many American lives, although many more people died from influenza than did in World War I itself.
Wow.
Many more, a lot more, in fact. So that actually, it's sort of a confounding factor, because by and large, a lot of historians of influenza, I'm thinking in particular of the work of Alfred Crosby, The Forgotten Pandemic, as he entitles his book, have pointed out that because of the other world sort of circumstances that were happening, the story of pandemic faded, right? We're living through a moment where I'm actually wondering to what extent will this be the unforgettable pandemic? As for lessons as to where do we go from here, I think that every epidemic leaves a mark on society. It leaves behind ways of coping and managing disease, but it also leaves behind cultural leavings. A lot of the kinds of public health practices that we still use today were actually born in the time of bubonic plague. We don't think of them in that way, but things like health boards, they weren't called that, but the essential apparatus for public health, things like cordon sanitaire, quarantine itself, these were all practices that were first instituted in a plague context that we still use in different manifestations into today. Do I think we're going to end up? I don't know, but I have a feeling we're going to be wearing a lot more masks. We're going to be spending a lot more time practicing social distance. We're also going to be washing our hands a lot more, which is wonderful. It's a great thing. I encourage that. But hopefully we'll also be thinking more broadly about our public health practices and our preparedness for the future.
Well, those are all great things to think about. In fact, we have a few questions in about either what the legacy of COVID-19 is going to be, or how this is going to change what we see, in the coming years or in the coming months in terms of healthcare or health preparedness, as you were saying. But we also have a number of questions that are asking you to speak to COVID-19 and race. So we have a question asking if you can talk to why we're seeing racial inequality in infection and mortality with COVID-19. This is a question from Tara Sutton. And then that is kind of added to with Maggie Hagerman is asking how the racial inequality we're seeing today, how that compares to maybe racial inequality or structural forms of inequality playing out in previous episodes of disease. So can you speak to the racial inequality now or other kinds of inequalities in the past?
Yeah, so this is a huge question. There are so many things I could say, but this is why the social component of a disease, understanding the social dynamics of disease, is always so crucial. Because of course, a disease is never just the virus, it's the other circumstances around it that shape who gets sick, what kinds of suffering they experience, what kinds of treatment they are able to have, what kinds of stigma or sympathy they might receive. And I think that as an example of what this looks like in practice, I think that a few things. First of all, we have the fact that America is a nation with a lot of different kinds of structural inequality. Poverty shapes healthcare outcomes. It also shapes, there's all sorts of sort of layered aspects. So poverty, right, often goes hand in hand with malnutrition and food insecurity, which often goes hand in hand with low access to preventive healthcare. These things tend to be exacerbated in certain parts of the country. Rural areas, the Deep South, where we are here in Mississippi, has very low health outcomes, and race often goes hand in hand with these elements, like poverty, like access to healthcare. These have very deep historical antecedents. So something which emerged in the middle of the 20th century in both northern and southern cities all across the United States, which was actually a federal practice of essentially preventing down. Julie, are you okay there?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm sorry. I have a landline because I'm very old-fashioned and it's ringing very loudly, and I don't know how to turn it off without getting closer to it. But please keep talking, Courtney.
So redlining is something that tended to be mostly about who could get buildings, who could get funding and financing for particular kinds of buildings. But it also, in effect, basically made certain neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods that were predominantly African-American, undesirable for any kind of financial loans, assistance, mortgages, which meant that things like doctors' offices tended not to be founded in these areas, which meant that had less access to healthcare. Race and disease are two things that often go hand in hand in other social ways. Stigma, especially, tends to accompany ideas about disease and susceptibility. If you code a disease as low class or as something that filthy and dirty people are more likely to experience, then first of all, that's going to mean that that group of people is going to have a harder time seeking any sort of health care, but also sympathy, right? Stigma and sympathy are really important factors in who is cared for, both literally and figuratively. I feel like there's a lot of other pieces I could talk about, but the other thing I want to mention is that racism can also shape other aspects of public health experiences. There's one of our own former undergrads here, Kyle Winston, recently published his undergrad thesis, and he wrote about the yellow fever epidemic in rural Mississippi in 1878. And what he found was that in the midst of that epidemic, mostly the white people fled towns, leaving behind African Americans who stepped up and did the health care, caring for the sick, both white and black. But when financial aid came in to pay for relief and pay for food, they were barred from receiving any of this relief. And that this kind of racism, and white supremacy, also shaped other aspects of how the disease continued. So he actually recounts in his essay an instance of a quarantine being set up around a town to prevent people from leaving or coming because of the fear of disease, that allowed a white lynch mob to pass through in order to lynch a black man. So in that case, white supremacy and racial violence was more important than protecting the health of the community. I think it says something about our priorities, even in times of crisis. That was a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to mention Kyle's research because he did it here, and I'm very proud of his work.
Yay, Kyle. I have a just kind of a follow-up question from all the things you were just saying. And thank you, by the way, you're handling these huge topics very succinctly, which is great. But Anne Marshall is asking a very specific question kind of within this. She says, can you compare the xenophobia aimed at Asians and Asian Americans with COVID to other instances in history? So you've kind of been talking about race more broadly. And here Anne has a question specifically about Asian Americans. And Anne adds that she's thinking about Typhoid Mary and anti-Irish sentiment, for example. So she's wondering if there are other examples you can think of where there was some kind of targeted group of people who received a lot of the brunt.
Sure. These are, there's lots we can talk about. And stigma, as I said, often go hand in hand with these of disease, and outsiders, foreigners, people who might have often been the targets of stigma around epidemic disease. As for xenophobia with Asians, there's actually a really important case antecedent to this was to the United States right around the turn of the 20th century. I believe it touched down right actually in 1900. Bubonic plague, as you're probably familiar, had a very long history, and there was an outbreak in the middle of the 19th.
Oh, Courtney? I think you froze for just a minute.
Century, at around 1900. Bubonic plague made its way first to Honolulu via Chinese trade routes from Hong Kong, and then from Honolulu moved along trade routes. Sorry, go ahead, Julia.
That's okay. You froze for just a minute, so I'm just saying that it sounds like you're saying there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in the early 20th century, and it had its origins in China. Is that what you were saying?
It had its origins in Southeast Asia, and it came along trade routes from Honolulu in 1900, and then to California, especially San Francisco in California, which had a plague from between 1900 to 1904. Now, plagues, diseases don't have a politics, but the way humans deal with diseases often does. And in the case of the plague that touched down first in Hawaii and then in California, racism and xenophobia absolutely followed. So this is in the decades after the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a lot of racial animus and distrust of Chinese Americans, of other Asian Americans. You effectively couldn't be naturalized in this period if you were Chinese. And so when it touches down in Honolulu, in Chinatown, or where some of the first cases come from, there was actually an attempt to burn down the houses, which for various reasons led to the burning of all of Chinatown, mostly by accident, but it led to 6,000 people losing their homes. When it touched in San Francisco, meanwhile, there was about a 4-year-long plague there. And there was actually the story of San Francisco, the San Francisco outbreak.
Okay, Courtney, coming back.
Is actually kind of, So the first response
Mhm.
after the autopsy of this man was to quarantine the entirety of Chinatown in San Francisco. And this quarantine lasted 2 days initially because there were a lot of actual legal challenges to this. Then a second quarantine of Chinatown that also blocked anyone from East Asia from entering California. So this was basically scapegoating the Chinese Americans and other immigrants from South, even though they were not the only ones who were getting the disease or carrying the disease, a complete lockdown of this neighborhood. Now, it's really interesting about, and of course, if you look at the political cartoons of the time, they're hugely racist, and they're basically assuming that Asian immigrants are dirty and filthy and dangerous to the white Americans. Now, two things are interesting about this particular plague outbreak. The first is that despite these quarantines of Chinatown and the attempts of local and state authorities to basically contain the disease outbreak to Chinatown in particular in San Francisco, the governor, who at the time was Henry Gage, publicly denied that there was any plague at all. The newspapers fell in line. They're basically, the federal government is asking them, is there a plague? And they're like, oh, no, there's no plague. We just have Chinatown locked away for no good reason, just no reason. And so eventually what happens is the newspapers and Gage keep perpetuating this lie because they're trying to
Okay. Oh, what a time.
knowledge how the plague spreads to the extent that other states start to enforce quarantine lines against anyone coming from California, which leads to a kind of interstate crisis about things like trade and truth. Now, the other story is that in 1906,
sorry, I'm going to stop you for just a second. Just you're explaining a lot of really interesting things, and you froze a couple times within your explanations. So I'm just going to see if I can put the pieces together a little bit. So it sounded like there was an outbreak in Chinatown. They quarantined, the federal government quarantined all of Chinatown, and then the media. You were saying something about newspapers.
Yeah. So there was a gag rule, essentially. The newspapers lied and said there was no outbreak. The governor lied and said there was no outbreak. So even though they were quarantining people and keeping them from leaving their homes, they were also lying to the federal government and to the nation at large, as well as their own citizens, about the nature of this outbreak, which is very dangerous because that's how disease tends to keep spreading if you are lying about the nature of disease.
Right.
Eventually, word did get out, and so other states started to enforce a quarantine against California, keeping people from California from crossing into their borders. Now, what's really interesting about this, of course, is that during this first outbreak between 1900 and 1904, huge amounts of racism and xenophobia led to extreme restriction of the movements of especially Chinese Americans. However, in 1906, San Francisco had an earthquake, which for various reasons led to a second outbreak. But this outbreak was among wealthy white residents. Guess who were not quarantined in their homes? And guess which neighborhoods were not barred? And which lies were not spread? So we can say that race profoundly shaped the experience of the bubonic plague outbreak, and that it's also just one of many examples of immigrants, especially non-white immigrants, for being sort of scapegoated for the spread of disease. And in so doing, this creates circumstances which actually allow the disease to continue to spread. Mary Mallon is another great example. I know Anne brought that up. Mary Mallon was an Irish-American immigrant at the turn of the 20th century, around the same time actually as, in the 19-teens really. And Mallon was an asymptomatic carrier. So she carried typhoid, never had been sick herself, or at least denied having ever been sick, but she worked as a cook among wealthy families. And so she spread typhoid along with her. An asymptomatic carrier is somebody who carries the disease but has no symptoms of the disease. Now, what's interesting about Mary Mallon, and there's a great book about her called Typhoid Mary by historian Judith Levitt, is that Mary Mallon was not the only asymptomatic carrier of typhoid who was identified in New York at the same time. There were at least 2 other men who were also identified as asymptomatic carriers who were also working in the food industry, right? So they were also infecting people. But Mallon had a few strikes against her. She was an Irish-American female immigrant, low class, who was also known for living with a male lover and having a dirty dog. They love to talk about how she had a dirty dog.
Oh.
And so a combination of gender, class, and racial or ethnic assumptions are what led to her eventually being quarantined for most of her life on North Brother Island, which was a quarantine site in the New York Harbor. Whereas these other asymptomatic carriers who were men, at least one was an immigrant, but they were men with families, so they couldn't be taken away from their families. Their labor was too valuable. So Mary Mallon became a sort of scapegoat because of the confluence of her gender, her ethnicity, her class, and other sort of assumptions about her.
Right. So, so if I could bring things back up to today a little bit more, we've gotten a lot more questions about what is happening today with COVID-19 and the government's response to this disease. So Nancy Traylor Hurd, for example, she points out that a lot of people have been shocked at learning the disparity of healthcare for people in the country right now. And we kind of see a lot of, I guess, the structures of inequality that a lot of this is based on. But she asks if you think that this current COVID-19 pandemic will inspire policymakers and healthcare workers to address this healthcare gap in the United States.
This is a wonderful question. I am very eager to know the answer myself. The history of healthcare in the United States, especially healthcare disparities, is a complicated one. And it's built a lot, I think, on, so there's a few different ways we can look at this. We can think about healthcare gaps in terms of racial and structural inequalities. We can look at the history of rural healthcare. But I think actually a lot of this comes back to the way we pay for healthcare in America, which is very unlike how most developed nations pay for their healthcare. So we have a complex system, but the short version is ours is the only developed nation in the world that has no single insurance, that has, I'm trying to think of the way to put this, that does not make use of, oh boy, my brain is just, that doesn't have universal health care, right? And that has a complex system of private insurance that's largely tied to your employer. Now, this is there are medical economists and historians of medical economy who work on this, but we have a few problems, right? So first, we're a federalist nation. So each state is kind of doing its own thing, right? To a certain extent.
Right.
So we have no nationalized or centralized system. We have no nationalized or centralized system of pay. And then we also have the fact that plenty of people, it's a political hot potato. Like even bringing this up, I'm like, oh gosh, I'm going to get 20 comments about how I'm bringing politics. But all of history is political at the end of the day. I don't know where I'm going with this. But I think the long and short of it is I see what's going to happen. But I think given the current state, while there will be a lot of talk about it, I do not necessarily expect that we'll have huge changes to our ways of paying for healthcare, which means there can't be many structural changes to healthcare itself.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you very much for those responses to this question. We're historians. We study the past. It's hard to know how to predict the future. Although we do hope that, there will be gains to be made from the experience that we all are going through right now. There's another question that is related to it that is asking also about federal intervention in our current disease problem that we have right now. This is a question from AJ Williams, and he says the federal government is taking drastic steps to reduce the spread of this disease by instituting curfews, reducing public services, closing or restricting business, etc. Do these government actions violate and go against the constitutional, federal, or state laws or rights of the people? And how do you view them being removed at the downward slope of the pandemic patterns? So is the federal government violating the Constitution with some of the measures they're taking right now? And then how should business, I guess, as usual, get started again once the curve flattens? I
mean, these are questions for a lawyer, especially. I cannot speak to the legality of anything that's going on. I do think it is worth noting that a lot of the steps that are being taken are not novel. They are, in many cases, very old. A lot of these exact steps were actually first instituted during the bubonic plague.
Wow.
So a lot of the things that we're seeing here actually grew up in the bubonic plague. During this, the influenza pandemic, what we are seeing is us historical attempts to halt the spread of disease. Whether they are constitutional or not, I do not know. But I can say that many of the things doing right now, curfews, reduced public services, restrictions on businesses, were also instituted during the 1918 influenza pandemic. So if they were legal then, I would not be surprised if they were also acceptable now. Ask the lawyer.
Okay, well, so in other words, there is a precedent for the kind of things that the federal government is doing right now. Just to bring things a little bit maybe back into our home territory, there's also been a question about how this COVID-19 pandemic is going to change academia. So let me just see. So two questions kind of on this. How will the practices that we're engaging in right now as academics change the way academia is run, generally speaking, in the near future because of this pandemic? And that's my version of a question I read by someone named Paige. And then this also seems related to another question by Tyler Powell, who is asking, what historians will be talking about with COVID in the future.
Big questions. They asked to be an oracle, and I'm more about the past than about the future, unfortunately. I think that what we're seeing right now in work in general, not just in academia, is that a lot of us are learning that our labor is possible to do at a distance, which I think has really interesting implications for teaching, for research. I'm seeing a lot of we received is now available to us, right? So there's lots of unavailable kinds of digital resources, for example, that previously were either closed to non-researchers entirely or were basically pay to play. That meant that poorer institutions and researchers could not access. So we're seeing in some ways a lot of equity regarding to access. If all of JSTOR and HathiTrust is open, then that doesn't just mean that you and I, Julia, can access these resources for our research. It also means that the public can. And I think that's a win. I would also love to not teach online again. I mean, we'll see if that's going to happen. As for what was the second hand?
Oh,
I don't know if I answered all of it.
I think, Courtney, I think you've given as great an answer as possible as one could as an historian, not a future predictor, as to how academia, the practices of academia are going to change because of this. The other question that I was asking was what future historians might see as takeaways for COVID. I always love these kinds of questions because I never know what to make of the present myself. There's always so much going on at the same time, and you're never quite sure which things are causing which other things and which things are really going to stand out as significant and which things are going to end up retreating into the background. So as an historian of medicine, are you kind of foreseeing dissertations of the future right now?
There's this funny thing in the history of medicine where there was a whole period in the 90s where every single book, no matter what it was on, the epilogue was always about AIDS, because that was the biggest sort of medical event that sort of shaped a whole generation of medical historians. I think we're going to see a lot of epilogues in books that are about coronavirus, whether they should be or not. As for what this means for the field, I think that there's going to be, I don't know what's going to happen to a lot of other areas of history, but I think there's going to be a greater interest in the history of medicine, in the history of public health and disease, possibly a greater interest in things like the health humanities and the medical humanities, especially because there are so many lessons we can and should be learning from the past that are relevant to exactly what our doctors and nurses are doing every day, what our public health officials, the decisions they're making, and what our patients are experiencing as they fight this disease and their families witness them fighting this disease.
So just getting back to history a little bit more, we've got a question here from Patricia McCourt. And she says that a lot of people are resisting some of the shelter-in-place orders or the closures that are in place right now. And she's asking if this was also happening. You mentioned before that there were precedents for the federal government to take actions to slow down businesses or to tell people to stay at home and things like that. Was there similarly in the past instances when people resisted those measures or resented them or tried to find ways around them?
Absolutely. I think one of the best examples is the practice of people running away when they're supposed to be staying in place, which is something you see in just about every single epidemic through history. Very famously during the Black Death, the plague, as cities were trying to shut their borders, the wealthy took their stuff and ran, right? So usually it's the wealthy who can move and who have the means to do so. And in so doing, they brought the virus with them, right? This is something we're actually seeing right now. There's plenty of stores, communities basically saying, please don't come here to Hampton.
Okay, Courtney, I think you froze.
Or wherever else, because there's resistance. Sorry.
Okay, Courtney, you froze off and on. Yep, Julia? I'm back here. Do you hear me now? You froze off and on for a little bit there.
Sorry.
You were saying that there's a lot of similarity between the way that people avoid federal restrictions now in the past, especially you're saying people were running away when they were told to stay in place. And then I couldn't quite make out the example that you were giving us.
So basically during the bubonic plague, for example, the wealthy tended to pack up their homes, take their servants and run to the country from the cities. And that's something we're also still seeing today. And of course, the irony is when people run from one place to another, when they try to evade quarantine, they spread disease almost inevitably. Another kind of resistance that's very common through history is the resistance to vaccination, resistance to either official guidelines to vaccinate. We see this today in current culture. Incidentally, this is something where I'm going to be very interested to see how the conversation about vaccination changes in our world post coronavirus. Especially because this, like some other very well-known diseases, the influenza of 1918, smallpox, very famously, these are diseases that largely have no treatment, right? I mean, there's no cure, right? So a vaccine is the thing, right? If you want to slow or halt or eradicate a disease. And if people are resistant to vaccination, then you will continue to have that disease pop up. It will become endemic as opposed to epidemic, which doesn't mean it goes away. It means it becomes part of daily life, as smallpox did in the 18th century, for example.
Right. So if I can follow up on that question with another, or you're on that response with another question that's kind of touching on something similar. Morgan Robinson is asking about the historical precedent for all of this. How are you doing? That's happening right now. She says, so, we have a running scoreboard. I'm quoting her here. We have a running scoreboard for how we're doing that continually helps determine what we're doing. Were there similar elements in the 1918-1919 experience? For example, running regional death tallies in papers, constant predictions of market performance, or can the experience be described as a more ground level and atomized? She continues, it strikes me potentially as a significant difference in what it feels like to live through a pandemic in the here and now than maybe it did 100 years ago. We are able to see ourselves as a nation experiencing it now. So were people able to see themselves experiencing it as a nation in 1918, 1919? Were people constantly being asked and being made aware of how they were doing?
Okay, so again, this pandemic was an unusual case because, so there are traditions in the history of epidemics, all the way back to the bubonic plague in the 14th century, smallpox outbreaks in the 18th century in Boston, for example. There were practices of essentially posting the lists of people who had died. These would be published in newspapers. They were widely spread. They were part of collective mourning. However, the epidemic of 1918 is kind of an unusual case because of the wartime context. What this meant, the reason why we call it Spanish flu is actually because of wartime censorship practices. In Britain and America, for example, newspapers were largely encouraged not to basically throw the populace into a panic. So they weren't supposed to report on local outbreaks of influenza, at least initially. Now, they could talk about was Spain, which was a place where the pandemic was happening, but it was also a place that was not part of it wasn't the Allies at the time, was it? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain, right? So they could talk about the flu in Spain, even if they couldn't talk about it in Philadelphia.
Oh.
So there is also the fact that the Spanish royal family experienced, very famously, also experienced the flu. I believe the king at the time. Is that right? I can't. I'm giving you a very brief example. So I think one of the interesting things about the Spanish flu, which again is not really Spanish, but even the fact that we call it that is actually evidence of this attempt to sort of keep these aspects of it secret and keep these aspects out of the newspapers. So there were attempts to not completely lie, but there was a lot of censorship in Germany and the United Kingdom, in France and the United States, which meant that neutral Spain became the site of the epidemic, especially because King Alfonso the 13th, sorry, I can't do them, was sick with the flu himself. So that's how we get the story of it being a Spanish flu. It's pretty problematic, looking for it in their own backyards, right? So censorship absolutely shaped that. Now, past that point, once the flu really there was no point, then absolutely stories were spreading. I don't think there was the same kind of collective mourning and grief, in part because of the overwhelming nature and the way that it hit the system in some places. Philadelphia very famously had so many corpses that they were stacked 3 and 4 deep in the basements of the city morgue, that they ran out of coffins, that the orphanages overflowed because so many parents died. So I think that there were certainly a lot of horrible stories coming out about the influenza, but they couldn't be spread like this, the way things can today, where you can see the instant a celebrity dies, for example, it's going to come up on your Facebook feed. The instant somebody in your community dies, you're going to know about it. And I think that just the spread of knowledge is very different.
Well, and just following up on that, because what you're saying right now fits into another question, and we'll just take maybe just a few more questions before we wrap up for today. But there's another question that this feeds into really well, which is about conspiracy theories. This is a question from Dee Dee Baldwin. She says, are there conspiracy theories around pandemics in the past, or if that's more of a modern thing due to social media?
I think there will always be conspiracy theories. We like to have explanations for why things are happening. Many diseases in the past were assumed to be examples of poisoning. So early accounts of cholera, for example, because of the nature of it's a very messy disease. It involves a lot of expelling of bodily fluids that look like strychnine poisoning, essentially. So often outbreaks of cholera at first glance looked like poisoning epidemics. Conspiracy theories in the past often had to do with concerted spread of disease. In the bubonic plague, for example, lots of accusations of witchcraft, but also a lot of sort of pointing at particular groups of people, saying these are the people who are spreading the disease, these are the dangerous people, and we need to do something about them. To the extent that, if I remember correctly, during the height of the plague in Strasbourg, France, which might be an example you're familiar with, Julia, citizens of that town rounded up the community of 200,000 Jews, brought them to the Jewish ceremony, and basically accused them of poisoning the wells where Christians drank, and saying that this was the source of bubonic plague. They told this community of 200,000 people that they either had to renounce their religion or they would be put to death.
Wow.
And about half of them were put to death and burnt alive on that day, a famous moment in the history of bubonic plague. So I mentioned that to say that conspiracy theories can be very dangerous. They lead to violence, stigma.
We just lost her, but we were going to have to wrap up eventually at some point anyway. So I'll just go ahead and we'll start that process right now. If Courtney's able to come back, I'm sure she'd love to finish that thought. But it does sound like, yes, there have been conspiracy theories dealing with pandemics in the past. There were a few questions in our Facebook comments that I'm afraid we weren't able to get to, but that's all right. The Institute for Humanities is planning on having future discussions like this. In fact, I think one of the questions we couldn't get to was a question on physicians and race, and whether physicians have prejudices when they treat patients, which I think is a really important question, especially for the pandemic as we're seeing it unfold right now. So we'll be really looking forward to talking about that in the future, I hope, as well. Courtney is able to come back just a second. Hi, Courtney. Right. Just a second, Courtney. I have to reintroduce you into the conversation. And then I'll just ask you if you have any thoughts to share before we wrap up. Let me just make sure that I can get you up here. Okay, there she is. Courtney, thank you so much for joining us again.
Sorry,
that's all right. I was just starting to wrap things up a little bit. Do you have any final comments that you would like to share with people who are tuning in with us right now, or any takeaways that you would like to show us?
Oh, gosh, so many. There's a lot of things I wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to get to. I think that what I want to let everybody know is that first and foremost, STEM is something, science, technology, and medicine are certainly important fields. And the way that we talk about STEM is often, why would you go to school to do the humanities? You should do STEM. That's going to contribute so much more to society. And what I think that we're seeing in this epidemic is that the humanities have a lot of lessons too. If I can quote once again my colleague Manuel Perry, history is the laboratory of public health. Everything that we are seeing, that we are witnessing, that we are experiencing right now, all the public health mitigation strategies, the emotional experience of living through epidemic. These are all things people in the past lived through. These are all strategies people in the past tried. And disease has shaped and brought us to where we are today. You can argue, and some historians have argued, that epidemic disease has molded and shaped the modern state that we live in. We wouldn't have a lot of the structures of the modern state without the experience of epidemic disease. So history is cyclical, and we learn a lot about, we can learn the lessons of perhaps we didn't lie about outbreaks. Truth is crucial. We should try focusing not just on the human cost to life, but on the cost to the living. And if I can quote one of my former colleagues and mentors, Frank Snowden, who is a very real historian of epidemics, and who I learned the history of epidemics from. Snowden has written epidemic mirrors that reflect who we back upon us. And by this, what I mean to say is that disease can bring out the worst in humanity, right? So for example, what happened in Strasbourg.
Oh, Courtney, we lost you one more time. I think, though, that you were going to follow up and say that disease can bring out the worst in humanity, but
also bring out society.
So, Courtney, I'm sorry, we lost you at the end of that quote there for just a second. So it sounded like you were saying that, yes, disease could bring out the worst in humanity, but it also sounded like disease could bring out maybe the best in humanity. Was that ending part of that phrase? I'm just going to hope that it was.
It teaches us, it shows it's us about fault lines in humanity, fault lines in society, but also about who we are as individuals and as a community. And if my connection wasn't so bad, I would share something, I would share a passage with you. But unfortunately, I don't think that my internet's doing too well today.
No, let's not tempt the internet. But what I think would be great for you to do is if you could type that thought, and if you could type that quote in the comment section of this interview, which that would be fantastic, because I'm sure there are lots of people who wanted to tune in and participate with us who were unable to. And this way, not only will they get to watch the interview and will they be able to learn from your participation, but they'll also be able to scroll down and see that final quote at the end. So Courtney, thank you so much for spending your time with us this afternoon. Thank you everyone who tuned in on Facebook. Thank you so much for your questions. I apologize to those that had questions that we didn't get to, but I am using those questions as inspiration for future speakers who might be able to speak to those things as well. So again, thank you all very much. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe. Bye-bye.